Guy Lamb. I'm with the Safety and Violence Initiative at the University of Cape Town. Welcome to the webinar on supporting victims of sexual violence, sort of looking at what currently happens within South Africa, what can be done better in the future, where is support needed. So we're very lucky and fortunate to have Lisa Vetton, who holds multiple institutional affiliations, one at the University of Johannesburg and also one at the University of Witwatersrand. And we also have Sianne Alves, who is the director of the Office for Inclusivity and Change at the University of Cape Town, which deals with supporting supporting victims of sexual violence in the context of a university. Both are very well-known scholars in this particular field, so we're very fortunate to have them. So thank you so much for being here. And just a quick intro on SaferSpaces. I'm sure everybody knows SaferSpaces, but we're a web portal. It's a partnership between the Civilian Secretariat for Police Services and various civil society organizations, NGOs, academic institutions that have an interest in crime and violence prevention. And it's allowed to continue thanks to the very generous funding from GIZ, the Violence and Crime Prevention Program. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Lisa, if you would like to get going and upload your presentation. And then once you've done your presentation, we'll hand over to Sianne, and Sianne can present, and then we'll have a series of questions and comments after that. So Lisa, it's in your hands.
Okay, can you see my presentation, Guy?
Yes, I can see your presentation. If you want to put it in Slideshare mode so we can get the full screen, if that's possible.
I'm just waiting for it to load on my side.
Okay, well, we can see it.
What have you got now?
So okay, wait, it's going to pop up. Just hang on. It's just processing. We did have a slideshow up, and then it disappeared. So maybe if you can do what you did before, you don't necessarily have to have the and slideshow format. It did have, where you've got the slides on the left-hand side. And oh, there we go. It's up.
Okay.
You're good to go. All right. I'll turn
now it's racing. Thanks. Well, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. What I'm going to be doing is drawing a little bit on some research that was done last year. Just to say one thing, and I think some of the things is something I'm going to come back to at the end. What I'm presenting to you has not been allowed to be publicly released, but I am going to be presenting some of it anyway, because I think there are very serious issues around embargoing knowledge in this area. And you will see towards the end, when you see how little knowledge there actually is, why I think it becomes very important that we start sharing information about the state of services, what is and isn't, and what is or isn't available, as well as what it would cost. I mean, I think we're in a current climate where a great deal is being said about how concerned we are about gender-based violence, and that is not necessarily translating into the appropriate costing of services that would enable them to be effective and to do what they need to do in order to give somebody a hopeful, meaningful, and pleasurable life again. So this is with the context of what I'm presenting here. It's a little bit of a snapshot of what we did in terms of trying to identify a core package of services around sexual violence and what these would cost. So then, just to begin with, one must say at the outset that there is, and this is one of the great problems, there is very, very little research around the impact of rape. We have a little bit about how awful the police are. We have a lot about the politics of rape, gender norms, etc. But in terms of actual evidence around the impact, there's very, very little. So what I'm presenting to you, in the attempt, I think, to go just beyond the anecdotal, comes from a few studies that we do have. So the one which I think is quite important was undertaken with 64 rape survivors who were recruited from the moment they came into the TCC and followed over a period of 6 months. The Western Cape study, and close to 3/4 were eligible for diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder at 4 weeks post-rape. So I think what's important to highlight, and it's going to be a point I reiterate throughout, is that high. 3/4 are exhibiting post-traumatic stress disorder, but 1/4 are not. By 6 months, we're seeing just over half are still meeting a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we can draw another conclusion from that, which is that it's possible that symptoms do subside over time of their own accord. And you'll see why I say that when we get to looking at the number of women who actually sought counselling. So slightly under half no longer have PTSD at 6 months. Although I think the question is what else, the question we might ask is what else might they be experiencing at 6 months. The second set of data comes from a Gauteng community-based survey, which is much larger than 64 rape survivors, and was looking at all group of women's experience and consequences of violence over a period of a lifetime. So the figures here don't relate to time post-rape. They are over a lifetime. So here, of those women who said they had been raped by non-partners, just over a quarter were suffering from PTSD, and roughly a quarter reported attempting suicide. So again, you can see a continuum here of clearly very serious consequences, and those which there may be other consequences, but they're perhaps not, they are of a different nature to suicidality and PTSD. Then I think the most recent study, which presented data in December of last year, tracked a series of rape complainants from the time they reported a TCC up and followed them up over a 3-year period, and also contrasted them with a control group who had not been raped. And I think one of the interesting findings, and again, this goes back to long-term consequences of rape, is that rape complainants were 60% more likely to contract HIV than women who had not experienced rape. But this you cannot attribute necessarily to the rapist or to the actual incident, because the risk started to increase from about 6 months after the rape. So what this data is telling us is something about the long-term consequences of rape. And I think why I want to emphasize that is because if you look at where most of our responses are located in South Africa at the moment, they're all loaded at the front end. They're all at the moment of reporting. There's very little thereafter. And I think what we can see from this data, which it should start to give you a sense of, is yes, some consequences do get better over time, but others do not. And there is a real need for long-term support here. That should be the first point to take from this slide. The second point is to look at counselling services. So to go back to that TCC study that I spoke about a bit earlier, of that group of 64 women, about 12 had gone for counselling. And when those who didn't were asked about their reasons why, they put forward 4. And the one was not knowing that there were counselling services available. The second was a question of difficulty getting to services. The third were feelings of shame and embarrassment over talking about the rape. And the fourth was feeling no need for counselling. So I think the points we can take from that is that victims' use of services is shaped by victims that are both institutional, so the type of assistance that may be offered, as well as personal to the individual, such as their shame. And I think we also have to look at the questions of the availability of services and their accessibility. So even if you know that they are there, can you get them? Are they being offered at times, days that are convenient to you? And possibly in terms of having no need of counselling, those could be questions of acceptability. Counselling is not necessarily universally accepted by everybody. It can have, some people feel it often emerges out of a very particular cultural framework that is not necessarily travels well across a diversity of cultural situations. So use of counselling services, I think one also has to look at those questions of accessibility, availability, and acceptability as to whether or not somebody will use a service. But I think the other point one has to make is that in addition to those barriers, there are also the questions about what it is that women value, and not all necessarily prioritize the same services. So if we look at data that was provided by the Thuthuzela Care Centres for the financial year 2017-2018, then almost 34,000 sexual offences were attended to by the TCCs during that 12-month period. But what is interesting is that of the adults' cases, over a third did not want to lay criminal charges. They just wanted health and counselling services. So again, to link this to the point I was making about where you locate services, this becomes important, because if you put all your services at a police station, for example, in a victim-friendly room, and if somebody's not wanting to report a rape, you are going to cut out those who do not want to report from access to services. And I think this point is made even more strongly when you start looking at the extent of underreporting. So we have no recent national survey. Our last one dates back to 1997, South African Demographic and Health Survey, and their data then was saying that only 1 in 7 women who'd been raped and had physical force used against them had reported the attack to the police. More recent study from 2010 in Gauteng, where 1 in 4 of the women interviewed had experienced rape in the course of their lifetimes, but only 1 in 25 went to the police. So very significant underreporting. Again, this is implications for where we locate services. And again, to reiterate, if you put your services at police stations and health facilities, you are excluding what are probably the great majority of rape survivors who are not reporting. So the first point I think we need to take from this data is that services need to be multiple entry points to services. You need to have them located in very many different sites, and you must never assume that all women are going to report. And so therefore you need to have services that are located possibly in community-based settings. And I think the other point to be taken from this is that those who are being reached at the moment of reporting, you are dealing with somebody who is in the first stages of shock, and so the kind of counselling you're offering needs to be attuned to that particular moment and that particular need. But I think for those who haven't reported, they may be seeking out services when they're past that immediate stage of acute stress. And so the nature of the counselling, the kind of help that you're going to be offering is going to be very different. So the points to be taken is not only do you need to locate services at a diversity of points, but you also need to be able to have a range of different kinds of service methods and modalities to respond to when somebody is seeking assistance. So I think this is a very simple way of thinking about how does one respond. I think it's useful to distinguish between stress, trauma, and crisis. And I'm giving what, for those who might work in the field of psychology might feel is a little bit of a simplified explanation, but I think just to help us organize how we think about stresses, response, traumas, and crises, and what that means for the nature of the assistance that we offer. So if we look at stress, situations where external events are perceived to place demands on individuals in ways that challenges or attack their resources, they can be mild or severe, and they might emerge following a single event, such as rape, or in situations where difficult events are the chronic conditions of someone's life, such as domestic violence. And in the case of the latter, the stress is going to be cumulative. And you might also see that in the situations where somebody has been raped, that the rest of their life might be very difficult, and the rape might be the tipping point that pushes it into something different and well beyond simply difficult circumstances. I think if we look at post-traumatic stress, that is talking to this kind of a situation, external events placing demands on individuals in ways that challenge or tax their personal resources. So that's where we refer to post-traumatic stress. But post-traumatic stress also obviously refers to the next element or dimension, which would be trauma, response to an event resulting in physical injury or one perceived to have caused psychological injury or wounding. And a central element of this perception is that one's worldview has been shattered and life itself irrevocably altered. So traumatic events can be experienced both psychologically, in the way individuals experience themselves as powerless or to be stripped of the capacity to make and sustain meaningful human communications, and physiologically. So both, we're going to use that mind-body split language, but it's not only affects one at the level of one's psychological and mental functioning, but also somatically, in the forms of aches and pains, an elevated heart rate, dry mouth, etc. So it has those two dimensions. Then crisis, as a third stage, is when people perceive themselves to no longer be able to cope, when their stress or trauma has reached a point where they are no longer able to manage and they feel progressively overwhelmed. And the outcome might be a state of instability or disorganization. So for somebody who's working in a counselling service, you might be somebody who's seeing somebody who might be obviously in one of these three in one of these three particular moments, moving towards one or other of the moments, or moving back and forth between them. Quite often people will come and seek counselling only when they are in a state of crisis, when they are no longer able to cope at all. And then one has to, and if they are in a state of crisis when they present, then that obviously has particular implications for the nature of the assistance that you're going to help with. I think just a last point to make about this. I've talked about post-traumatic stress. And I think people are very quick to talk about PTSD, it's passed into everyday language. But I think it's important to bear in mind that when we start talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, we are talking about a pathology, a diagnosis that is made on the basis of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And so there are particular conditions and criteria that need to be met before somebody is diagnosed as having a disorder. I think what is important to bear in mind is that not everybody develops PTSD, and nor is feeling in a state of crisis or feeling unable to cope or feeling stressed or being traumatized in of itself, it's not evidence of a psychological disorder. So just to emphasize, I think the complexity of how it is that we try to think about what is happening to people and how best to respond to them. And I think the point is that if people are left in situations of stress and trauma for long enough, it will turn into a crisis or a disorder if they do not get satisfactory assistance. But I think the last point to make before moving on is that in each instance, how somebody responds is strongly related to the meaning, the personal appraisal that they give to these events, which is why things like secondary victimization become so important. Because I think after something like this, people are incredibly vulnerable to the opinions of others. And so the manner in which they are approached, what they are told, how others treat them, is going to strongly influence the nature of the meaning that they give to the event, and therefore how adversely they are impacted. So this question of meaning and personal appraisal is extremely important in understanding how people respond and what to do in order to assist them. If we look at what are the kinds of helping responses that one could offer in terms of the nature of how people come in, so I think typically, and I mean, this is what you're seeing predominantly at the TCCs, for example, where somebody is coming in immediately after having been raped. But here, what you are primarily looking at, and this will be the same with somebody who's in a state of crisis, is to establish safety and to provide practical stabilizing assistance in the form of psychological first aid. Now, I think for a long time, people use and still use the language of debriefing. I'm not sure what they mean to, because there's debriefing in a popular everyday sense, but there's also a modality of intervention called critical incident stress debriefing. And this used to hold the idea that recounting a traumatic event in as much detail as possible as soon after the event as it occurred was really good for you. And that was the best way to stave off more serious consequences in the long term. However, I think subsequent research has shown that actually that's a really bad idea, and it makes it entrenches difficult feelings at that time and seems to exacerbate the likelihood of going on to develop long-term difficulties. Hence the shift towards psychological first aid and the emphasis on safety, practical assistance. So helping people to feel that they've got some control over their lives again, that there's some semblance of normality happening again before one starts delving into detail into the impact, the feelings, and the emotions. Very closely linked to, I think, psychological first aid, and I think these terms often get used interchangeably, is the notion of containment. So as its name suggests, it literally is about the ability to hold somebody's emotions and to not be overwhelmed by them. So it does talk to the particular kind of quality that is needed by those who are going to work in health facilities, or when somebody's about to go to court, when they're experiencing a very high degree of typically anxiety. You need to have somebody who is able to not be upset by the anxiety of others' strong feelings, typically of anxiety or anger, and to be able to hold it. And in doing so, can transmit, I think, what is quite a calming effect on the other person. So containment and psychological first aid, what you will typically need to be doing if somebody is reported, they're at the hospital and they are at the police station. And I think once help people get over that immediate shock of what has happened and trying to get their lives back into a normal and everyday routine, one shifts to counselling. And this can be short or medium term, as in 2 to 4 sessions. For some people that is sufficient. For some it might be 10. And people may come and go in and out of counselling. They may manage for a year or two and then have an event that may reactivate, or one experience, one episode that may reactivate all their memories of the rape, and so they may be precipitated into a state of crisis, and then they may come and seek counselling again. So one always has to be flexible about these things. But I think where people have people's difficulties, where they have perhaps not reported, where they've not told anybody, where they've decided, I'm never going to speak about this ever again, I don't ever want to think about it, it's too distressing. I think when their difficulties have become entrenched and ways of avoiding thinking about the difficulties, then sometimes that starts to cause very significant disruption to their lives. When people start to self-medicate, for example, whether through alcohol, sleeping pills, painkillers, whatever it may be, then that's the point at which specialized professional assistance may be very necessary, and occasionally some medication as well. So, having sketched that, what is actually available in South Africa? And I think I'll start with perhaps the most serious shortage, which is extremely concerning, I think, in light of some of those serious consequences that I highlighted earlier. And I think this is the group of rape survivors who are being least well served at the moment, is those whose difficulties do require specialized assistance. So if we look at mental health services in the public health sector, they're deeply compromised by unavailability. I think it's important just to explain to people the split that happens between the Department of Social Development and the Department of Health. So the Department of Social Development funds, in a very limited way, NGO services, but they will not fund any qualification really beyond that of a social worker or social auxiliary worker. Psychologists get funded by the Department of Health. So it means that NGO services who are funded by the Department of Social Development seldom have access to psychologists and seldom are able to employ them, and therefore have to rely on what's on offer in the Department of Health. And here you can see what we have. We have 9.3 per 100,000 population specialists in mental health, which is really very, very limited. You can see how few psychiatrists there are, how few psychologists. Social workers are slightly better. The other health or mental health workers would be referring to NGOs working in the mental health sector. So you can see that there is really very little specialized help available. And it's even worse if you are somebody living in a rural area in the public sector. You can see that 0.03 per 100,000 of the population. So we are not doing a good job of providing that kind of specialized care. And as I said, even more so if you live in a rural area. And since Savvy is based in the Western Cape, I mean, I'm not sure if things have changed since the time this assessment was done. But at that point, Eastern, Western and Northern Cape and Mpumalanga were reported to employ no full-time psychiatrists in the rural public sector. If we look at where the bulk of facilities are, they're based in typically the Tutuzela care centres who almost always are attached to an NGO. So the service offered at the TCC is often a satellite of the office where counselling may then be taking place. And I think this is the point I was making about loading all our help at the front end at the moment of reporting. So the TCCs are probably the most comprehensive of the services that can be obtained at this point in time if you have reported. But I think it's very important to point out that actually there are 55 TCs that are functional, fluctuate sometimes, but they do not represent all of what is available in the health sector. So if you look at what is available, then 281 health facilities are designated to provide PEP and to conduct clinical forensic examinations. So in theory, if you look at that 281, that's quite a good reach. potentially. But of that 281, we have 51 who have specialized services. And so it's useful, I think, to look at some research from MSF, who, when there were still 265 services in 2017, phoned them up to see what they could get, what sense they got of the spread and quality of services. And they were able to reach just under 2/3 of those facilities, of which 7% said we can't deal with rape at all, and we refer elsewhere, which is a bit concerning considering that they're designated and in theory are said to be offering the examination. About 1/3 have no access to social work services, which will mean that, and when they're talking about social work services, they're probably talking about social worker based at the hospital. So that means not dedicated to the facility, but you'll go onto a waiting list in order to be seen by the social worker. Then less than half had a separate area or room whose use was dedicated to rape patients. So most are going into what is a general casualty section. And that 86% were located in hospitals, which does limit their accessibility to rape victims in smaller and rural localities. So based on this research that we did last year, here's a bit of a breakdown of those 281 facilities. So 51 are the TCCs and 230 then are designated. Of the 51, 28 of the TCCs, so just over half, can offer an NGO service. In 23, the services are unknown, meaning that if there is a service that's going to be offered by the hospital, typically there'll be a hospital social worker or a hospital psychologist if they're available. If we look at those 230 designated centres, then 19 of them have NGO services, and 211 we have no idea what's happening there at all. So I think the picture you can see that even the little that we have, even if it's based at the front end, even that isn't reaching everybody. We do not have a basic standard of care that is offered wherever you go if you are reporting a rape to a designated facility. So my conclusion is that we have a long way to go, which goes back to, I think, the research I referred to, which points out, firstly, the very limited amount of research we have about the impact of rape, the very limited research we have about how women cope within the context of South Africa, very little we know then about populations like men, LGBTQ populations as to how they may be affected, very little about the impact of services, what is working, what is not, a great inadequacy in the funding of services. The main reason we have services in the TCCs is because they're being funded by the Global Fund, not because they're being funded by government. And the problem with being dependent on funding from an external donor is that it puts the service at the mercy of the donor's priorities. And those are not constant. So, I mean, the TCCs are an example of facilities that have funding for 3 years because the Global Fund is funding it for 3 years, and then the services disappear because there is no funding and the Department of Social Development hasn't stepped in. So, as I said, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, there is quite a gap at this point in time between public rhetoric and actual rands and cents and services that are entrenched, can be relied upon, are stable and secure, and can be there. So I'll conclude there.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a really insightful presentation, but incredibly sobering. And thank you also for presenting data that, you know, for the sake of conversations and the sake of insight and the sake of transparency, for presenting it. So I really do appreciate that. We're going to take Sianne's presentation now, and then we'll open up for comments and questions. But Lisa, whilst you're listening to Sianne, there were a few questions that appeared in the chat. If you don't mind just having a look at them, and
Sure.
when there's a chance for responding, if you can respond. So Sianne, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Guy, and thanks, Lisa, for setting the really academic and thorough scene in terms of the complexity that's facing us as a nation. Colleagues, thanks for your time, and I'd like to thank Dr. Guy Lamb and the Safer Spaces initiative for the opportunity to participate in this panel discussion and to share quite insular lessons and considerations for change, at least from the university perspective, in relation to victim support. I will be brief because I would like to go into discussion as quickly as possible. As I've mentioned, my experience is comparatively insular, and I speak from the perspective of the university. Yet I do think that some of the lessons learned and the considerations do have bearing for the broader context. And in my presentation, I'll be drawing upon 3 focal points. The one is obviously the lessons learned thus far, and then key innovations that we have begun to implement in the university. And I'm drawing on the expertise of the colleagues who are projected on your screen, and Isaac Yumna-Sadat and Sianne Boda, who have really helped us think much more deeply about how we provide victim support, as well as the legalities to protect survivors on campus. And then I'll end off with some considerations that we're currently grappling with. Just for the basis of understanding, you may already be familiar with the terms. I will be referring to terms such as survivor, complainant, and respondent. And a very high-level overview or descriptor is a survivor who's been directly affected by gender-based violence. A complainant would be the survivor who's moved into reporting, and a respondent would be the person who's accused of the offence. Colleagues, in terms of lessons learned, many of the systemic changes in the provision of victim and survivor support was informed by UCT survivors themselves. And as a university, we really needed to navigate the legalities of the requests that were being asked for, such as the ability to provide and sustain anonymity when reporting. And then in addition, and I'm really glad Lisa pointed to this already, the resourcing for important structures, such as a special tribunal that had expert panels to oversee cases, who understood deeply what gender-based violence was and the impact thereof, and also to ensure that such a tribunal can expedite the cases through the internal as well as potentially external systems. And the other aspect that was raised was ensuring that first responders were adequately trained to provide support on campus. And this is quite key, again, alluding to what Lisa has raised, as who are capacitating people on campus, because victims and survivors are already turning to individuals, their peers, their religious leaders, their lecturers, their friends, to find support. And so the capacitation on the ground was a critical lesson for us to learn. And specifically during the years of protest from 2015 up into 2017. And based on these requests that came through from survivors, we did sustain some good practice that had already existed, but we introduced a number of key innovations. One of the good practices that we did sustain, which most of you are already familiar of in your own work, is a 24-hour standby number. What differentiates our approach here is the fact that regardless of where the incident takes place, if you're a UCT student or UCT staff member, we will come to you. Regardless of where the incident takes place, we will work with SAPS if it's external or in a different province. And we do have quite a strong relationship with SAPS nationally, and I have been able to call upon them in a number of ways thus far successfully. And we do have established relationships with the Forensic Unit of Victoria Hospital for Cape Town cases. So we also work with the UCT campus security on site should any incidences occur. In terms of case reporting, this was a deep requirement that came from the survivors. And what we wanted to ensure and really respond to in terms of the survivors' requests was that they have transparency around their cases, so that they know at any point in time where their case was within the university system and what was the latest update, so a live update of who was seeing their case, what was the consultation about, what was the outcome at that stage. And in addition to the transparency around the survivors knowing where their case is at, which also enabled their own agency and management of their case, we were able to start tracking repeat offenders in the system, which has proved very useful for the university in terms of building a case against offenders and reporting them to SAPS. We also, the case also holds mechanisms that are accountable for gender-based violence prevention and response. It holds those individuals, including myself, accountable. And so we are able to time how long each mechanism takes and begin to intervene much more quickly should there be a blockage in the system. One of the key things that Lisa said in her presentation, and I really value this point, is the fact that for us as the university, we needed to rethink our approach to providing victim support, because our initial response previously, before I took up the position of director, was a reporting mechanism. So come in and report. And what we did since early 2018 was to reconceptualize that whole dynamic and bring in the experts, the organizations that are doing the meaningful and authentic engagement around psychosocial support, speaking of containment, but then also building in long-term support. And I'm really glad Lisa's research speaks to this, because what we're finding is that there are more and more survivors that are coming together as peers in a survivor support group to support and enable each other. And they have expressed that they feel so much less isolated on campus, because for once they can see each other on campus, they can reach out to each other informally via WhatsApp, and then they can come together on a Tuesday evening and they can utilize that space either for psychosocial support, discussion, playing games, just being as a collective, understanding and empathizing with one another. So just to summarize some of the key changes, obviously the psychosocial support has foregrounded our approach. But we have also strengthened partnerships with external stakeholders. So I did mention SAPs. Apologies, I'm not sure what's happening with Skype for Business on this. I'll continue. What has also, one of our other stakeholders that we have, I'm not sure what you can see at the moment, Guy, but Skype for Business is opening all on its own. Okay.
It seems to be processing, and we've got your significant changes, and we've got your bullet points up with the photo of the purple T-shirt campaigners. So yeah.
Fantastic. We're on the right slide. So I'll quickly finish off. As I've spoken, we have established meetings with SAPs, the advocates from the Sexual Offences Court, as well as at least for the main campus. We work quite closely with Rondebosch Police, Family Violence and Child Protection Sexual Offences Unit. But in addition to that, we do liaise with the NGO sector, rape crisis and other counselling practices. But again, drawing on what Lisa has said, these are soft-funded institutions, and the cost on them and the capacity to hold space as well as provide services for nationally is quite critical, and the demand is only increasing. Most notably, and I want to go a little bit slowly here, is the fact that we have introduced innovations in the tribunal proceedings, internal tribunal proceedings. Utilizing administrative law and ensuring that we are compliant with criminal justice, as well as the Code of Good Practice, as well as the employment equity law. And our main focus here was to reduce secondary victimization of survivors. And so what you see on your screen is our flow, our infographic that provides an overview of the internal process. Once a person reports to the Office for Inclusivity and Change, the survivor may choose to use an informal process. We only provide informal processes for instances of sexual harassment, unless it is grievous. Sexual assault and grievous forms of sexual harassment are managed only through a formal process, which is a disciplinary process. From there, the special tribunal takes over the case. They utilize an investigation panel, and they have a specialized panel of student and staff assessors who have a lens or understanding of gender-based violence, but they do receive specialized training. And then the proctor is always a proctor who oversees gender-based violence cases and has expertise in the area. Both the survivor as well as the accused have support in the sense of being guided through the process. The accused has more guidance. The survivor is allocated a lawyer from the university and that is represented by the university and has special conditions that they do not come into contact with the accused at any point in time. So they are able to provide in-camera evidence during cross-examination. And if we consider our as-is picture at the moment, if we had to take any one element away from our ecosystem of victim support and response, we would be failing at providing holistic response to the survivor. So we do work collaboratively with external partners, but we also recognize that beyond the psychosocial support and the legal support, we have a very firm focus on physical safety and infrastructure as well. So some of the considerations that I'd like to share with you are the following, and these are some of the challenges that we still experience when working with our survivors in either internally or externally. And the first is the remedies for protection in the national context are often hard to acquire, particularly when we have instances of stalking via electronic, digital, or social media. And trying to track or trace an individual internally on campus has proved impossible for us. And certainly externally, it's literally impossible for us to assist a survivor or for the police to provide some form of protection. We also find that when we do take a survivor to the police station, it is becoming much more harder to provide a proof, the burden of proof for imminent threat or danger. And we often have to stand there and justify that and provide a rationale, which I can understand SAP's approach, but it is quite a demoralizing and quite a fearful experience for a survivor to have to go through. I want to also acknowledge victim support service providers and, drawing from the white paper that was released, we need to acknowledge that the survivors are going to turn to people of their own choosing, people, organizations of their own choosing, because they trust them or because they have heard about their good work and they want to go there, and recognizing that these people or organizations are not quote unquote registered service providers as per the white paper. And so we need to really recognize that there are important organizations and people and volunteers already doing this critical work, and we need to question the necessity of the registration so that victims don't feel limited in their choice, but are rather enabled. It's also important, again, and I'm going to stress this, connecting to Lisa's point, that most of these organizations are self-funded. Another point that we are finding that is quite critical is noting that survivors and the WHO comes to report, the statistics are showing that it's only women, but we know that there are trans, sexually diverse, gender diverse, disabled persons, particularly Black women, people of color who wouldn't take up the opportunity of reporting for a number of valid reasons. And I'm just stating that as a critical factor that we need to consider going forward. And then another aspect that we struggle with, even with our students and staff, is trying to grapple with how do we return the victim or the survivor to their place of, or to their home, or their community when that has been the site of violence. And we need to think about how do we establish a safe return, if at all. And most of the time we work with organizations like Mosaic to give us some guidance in that regard. So my last slide is really future solutions. How can we improve and support and enable the agency of survivors and victims? And I think the answer is, as most of you in this room would know, is to provide the environment for their decisions to take root and to thrive, with all the support that we can offer to provide holistic care, support and intervention. I personally think that the digital forensic services needs to be much more quickly available and much more accessible to survivors. At the moment it is not. It would form part of a court order or investigation process. I think that specifically within the higher education sector, there needs to be an integrated system of tribunal outcomes and procedures to ensure that offenders do not move from one university to another. And therefore we are able to track them within the education system and beyond, potentially. And then lastly, enabling the agency of volunteers, so individuals who are already trained, equipped, competent, have the capacity to hold space calmly, and to provide that psychological first aid that Lisa spoke of. More recently, the Code of Good Practice for Sexual Harassment in the Workplace has really asked the workplace to step up and provide a much broader, holistic overview of services as well as support. And it is a challenging Code of Good Practice, but I think it is a fantastic start to pushing the workplace into the right direction, because drawing again from what Lisa said, the workplace is a stressor, particularly for staff who are experiencing abuse or domestic violence. We need to be thinking more flexibly about how do we adapt the workplace so that we can provide flexible and, yes, rightly so, extraordinary work conditions that give survivors space for healing, recuperation, without fear of loss of annual leave, job loss, or financial loss, or even stigma. And so those are some of the elements that I'd like to leave you with today. And I really do hope that it sparks discussion. I saw some really familiar names in the room, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, the collaborative thinking, and even feedback on how you think we could implement change for victim support at UCT. Thanks very much, Guy.
Thanks so much, Sianne. That was an excellent presentation. I think what I already took from it was what is possible in a university or an institutional environment where there are some resources for this, where there is leadership, where there are committed people, thoughtful people, taking a very kind of consultative process to this, listening to what survivors have to say. So thank you so much. It's kind of really kind of gives one hope sometimes that that these things could be replicated elsewhere. So thank you so much, Sianne. We now have about 25 minutes or so, just under 25 minutes for any comments or questions. So I'm going to open the floor. If you can please use the raise the hand function. So I'm not sure how your teams are set up, but usually at the top of your screen, you'll see an emoji with a hand. So you want to put your cursor or your mouse over that, and then the hands icon you want to click on if you want to raise your hand. So I've also noticed that Lisa has responded to some of the questions that were raised in the chat. She's responded to them in the chat if you want to follow those. But now the floor is open. So please raise your hands. If we have a number of hands, I'll give you an opportunity to all ask your questions up to about 4, and then we'll hand back to Sianne and Lisa for responses. So over to the audience. Right, Lizo, I see your hand is up. Over to you, Lizo. Lizo was struggling. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. Can I speak?
Yes, you can. Sorry, there was just a bit of delay with the audio. It's over to you.
Thank you very much. I've already written down my concern. I don't know whether you can see it on the. My concern was about the victims, rape victims. When we working with them, do we actually go to that stage where we let them deal with the feelings that they have during the incident of rape? Sometimes they will experience feelings of enjoying this place, this thing, and also it's so confusing to them because why should they enjoy something that they don't agree on? How do counselors work on those kind of feelings, or do they actually get people that talk about such feelings? Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. We'll just hold on to that question and see if we can collect some more or any more comments. Maybe if I can just sort of make a comment, sort of whilst others think about comments or questions. A question for Sianne. You've kind of presented the sort of picture with the University of Cape Town and all the work that's been into it. Maybe if you could then just talk about if you're aware of what's happening at other higher education institutions, whether universities or technical colleges or FET colleges. I know you've been part of some processes, also working at a sort of a regional, international level. So if you don't mind kind of providing us with a bit more information about that. But others, please, if you could just ask your questions. I mean, the chat is a good place to do it, but it's better for the conversation if you can put up your hand and just ask your question, unless, of course, you've got bandwidth problems. Right, I don't see any hands coming up, so maybe what I can suggest is to hand back to the speakers and just give you an opportunity to respond to these two questions, but also to other issues that were raised. I see, Lisa, and your comments even to the chat, if you want to kind of build on those, or if you want to respond to some of the things that Sianne said. So maybe we'll start with you, Lisa, if you've got any additional things to say, and then I'll hand over to Sianne. So Lisa, over to you. Lisa, you're muted if you can hear me.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right. To start with Lizo's question, I mean, I think the purpose of counselling, Lizo, is to be able to create a space where somebody can deal with their difficult questions, feelings that leave them feeling ashamed and humiliated or full of self-hatred. And those kinds of questions are the kinds of the question you've raised is a very key one to explore. I mean, counsellors need to be trained to create a space that feels non-judgmental and safe, where somebody can talk about what is very difficult, because those are the most important things to try and deal with, or the things that are that create confusion, that leave you feeling ambivalent, that leave you wondering about how much you are to blame, that leave you feeling ashamed and humiliated. Those are probably some of the most important questions to explore. So what one tries to do in train a counsellor is to be able to create that environment where somebody feels they will not be judged if they say this, and that you also have a counsellor who is adequately trained to be able to deal with that. Because you can have counsellors who may not be very well trained, who think that counselling is telling other people what to do. And that may also include telling them how to feel. Oh, you shouldn't feel that way. Oh, it's not like that. If you are really engaging with somebody and their difficulties, then you will listen to what they have to say, even if, and this is the important thing, is I think a lot of counsellors dealing with rape can be acutely uncomfortable. It can raise very difficult feelings, not only within the person who is speaking, but the person who is listening, which is why a lot of people often don't want to hear about rape, precisely because of the difficult feelings it evokes in them. And some of the things one has to do, I think, when you're training counsellors, is to be able to talk about what does rape evoke in you, how do you manage your emotions, and when you are affected by other people's emotions, how do you sort through what are your emotions and what are somebody else's emotions. And I think sometimes, because it is distressing, counsellors who haven't been very well trained often try to make things better. Instead of, oh, no, it's fine, it'll be okay. No, you don't need to think like that. That is not helpful, because the person has come to you to be able to explore those difficulties. And so counselling needs to spend as much time on how do you create that space as how do you manage somebody's difficulties, and you don't take on their feelings. You don't start to confuse what you're feeling with what they're feeling, or impose your feelings or your emotions on them. So training is key. And following on from training, what I think is also not sufficiently attended to is ongoing debriefing and supervision for counsellors. So this can bring up very difficult feelings for you as the counsellor. Quite often those who seek to be counsellors have their own experience of violence themselves. And if they haven't adequately dealt with that, then listening to somebody tell them about their experience of violence can evoke all their own difficulties. And then you have two traumatized people, not only the victim, but the counsellor. So the question of training is exceptionally important, so is the question of supervision. And supervision should be the place where counsellors can go to somebody who is a social worker or who is a psychologist to say, I don't know what to do here. I am stuck with this case. I don't know how to manage it. Or somebody told me about this, and ever since they've told me about this case, I cannot stop thinking about it. It's taken over my life. It's a place where counsellors also have to explore how they manage their own feelings and responses to being raped. So it's all a question of training and supervision. And sometimes you actually do have to say to people, you may not be suitable as a counsellor. There may be many other things in life that you're good at and that you're better suited to. Because counselling it's difficult and it can be frustrating sometimes. So it's really important, I think, that one does clear selection of who is to do this and that you give them the ongoing training and support. And I think the last point I'd like to link to that, and it goes back to funding, is that when services are inadequately funded, training and supervision tend to be the first things that drop off the agenda because there's nobody to provide it. So it's a very important thing to be providing money for. And I think also to pick up on Sianne's point about registration. I spoke about the seriousness of rape, but I think what I also wanted to allude to in my presentation, not everybody is affected in the same degree. So it's perfectly appropriate to have a well-trained, well-supervised counsellor dealing with people who are having difficulties, but whose difficulties are perhaps not lying within the realm where they need psychological intervention. And unfortunately, I think there's not enough recognition of those counsellors. There's not enough support of them. I personally would like to see a qualification created that recognises community-based counselling, sets a sort of minimum level of training that they should receive and stipulates they should have training, but that they do get recognized. And there's another important point for that recognition, and here I'd like to link back to what Sianne was saying, is that peers are often, one of the reasons why people might not go and seek counselling is because they can't identify with the psychologist or the social worker or the organisation. They don't feel comfortable there, but they feel more comfortable with people from their own community, whether that community be students or geographical community. So I think lay counsellors who are properly trained and appropriately supported ought to be recognised because they bring qualities of acceptability that let's say, take me, white, middle class, middle-aged, professional. Somebody may not look at me and want to and may find I'm very off-putting to them. They don't identify with me at all. Whereas somebody drawn from their community who feels more familiar may be a whole lot more acceptable and therefore more successful as a counsellor than I would be. So hence, I think the importance of recognising that everybody does not have to have a professional qualification. And having a professional qualification doesn't always make you a nice, empathic human being, if you will, excuse me being rude. But so recognize that we need a mix and a blend of different types of skills, different kinds of acceptability. There is space for community, and it just needs the appropriate training, support, and supervision, in addition to the professionals who we also need. So it's the blend that I'm talking about. And in a country like South Africa, we do not have a social worker, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist for everybody. And community counsellors can do a good job.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Maybe Sianne, if I can invite you to come in here.
Sure, thanks, Guy. I'm going to respond to your particular question, Guy, which was, what is the higher education sector, including TVET colleges, doing and thinking about? And there has been three exciting initiatives. A lot of the universities, I say a lot, we're looking at about 5 to 8 universities at the moment, are building their systems of online reporting, which I think we're moving in the right direction now, because we're able to, I think at some point we're actually going to be able to link our systems up and be able to track offenders through the system and actually prevent transference of harm into other spaces. The other second point of interest is that some universities have grouped together regionally to become part of a Safer Cities approach. I know that there are possibly going to be 2 pilot studies done here in South Africa, and it's led currently by the UN Women Agency organization. And this again bodes quite well, because not only would they be drawing on university academic expertise and research to underpin the approaches, but they are working holistically, again, looking at that ecosystem of response and prevention. What are engineers doing? What is our infrastructure looking like? How are we working with students on campus and the surrounding communities in the vicinity of the university and the colleges? So it's a very promising and exciting initiative on the cards that has been delayed, unfortunately, by COVID. Then lastly, one of the major drives called the PESA campaign, again driven by UN Women and other sponsors, is the focus on what they call he for she, and they've broadened the term now to include bystanders and allies. And their focus is on looking at how we as men and counterparts are able to step into spaces to prevent harm against women and other survivors. And I think this is quite an interesting initiative, because again, due to COVID, they've moved this training into the online space, and they've seen an increasing uptake of individual training by universities as well as colleges. So yeah, 3 interesting initiatives thus far, and I just want to maybe overarch this with the recent release of the Department of Higher Education and Training Gender-Based Violence Policy, which is not without contention. It is a critical piece of it is a critiqued document, and rightly so. But it is a start, and it gives guidance to both under-resourced universities and colleges and resourced universities and colleges. It gives guidance, it gives us a starting point to work from and to progressively realize some of those minimum standards for change that we know we desperately need on some of our campuses. Thanks, Guy.
Thanks, Sianne. It's kind of really good to hear there's been quite a lot of progress happening, and of course it's really unfortunate that COVID undermines it. There's obviously a number of comments that are happening in the chat, so I'm just trying to keep an eye on that. But I just want to now, for a last opportunity for anyone to ask any comments or questions. I have another one, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. I want to give other people an opportunity to ask a question. So now is the time.
Guy, if I can just add something.
Of course, go for it, Lisa. I've got a question for you. Just hang on, Lisa. I've got
okay.
a question for you since you're about to speak. Just how does, maybe if you can just comment on the most recent GBV plan, femicide plan that's come out of the presidency, and how it relates to survivors and victims of sexual violence in your response as well. So back to you, Lisa.
I think what I will say, and this will go back to what I said at the beginning, my great concern is that one of the goals set for Pillar 4, which deals with response and healing, was to look at the identification of a minimum set of core services and to cost those, which was done last year and finished. And we have one. It was done by 2 departments. One department has approved it. The second has been sitting on it now for 6 months. It is deeply concerning. Because this is my point about with all the rhetoric. You have the document. Why are you not doing what you need to in order to have it released? Because I think the area of funding to organizations is so contentious. And there are also these unanswered questions about funding to organizations. So this new fund that has been set up, so many questions being asked about that. Who will manage it? How do you access it? What is it for? I think there were an enormous number of questions asked last year about the funding that the National Development Agency made available. There are some extremely odd choices on that list. So I think there also is a broader question. And I think this is what concerns me a little bit about the document, and in fact, not just the document, but I think a broader language in South Africa. And it is the statement that prevention is better than cure. At a superficial level, yes, of course, that's true. The point is, nobody has yet found a 100% immediately effective cure for rape. So if you take away money from services, you are actually creating a whole lot of other problems, which you fail to see that counselling is preventing. So I think there's a very narrow understanding what prevention is. Instead of it only means preventing violence, rather than we also want to prevent things like HIV acquisition, long-term psychological difficulties, etc., etc., etc. So I think the notion of prevention needs to be considerably expanded and start from the recognition that nobody has found the magic wand, 100% effective, silver bullet, it will work tomorrow solution. And until such time, we need services and they must be properly equipped. Just to continue my rant a little bit further, because I do feel quite strongly about this, especially in relation to domestic violence, is I think research is so clear about how, in a case like domestic violence, that if you don't provide services, you might end up having situations of repeat violence. That if you expose children to violence, there is a very good chance that they're going to grow up to either be involved in violence as those who commit it or those as victims. So services are preventive. So I think the conversation around prevention versus response has become very unhelpful. And I see elements of that in that document. So that's there's a lot more I could say about the document, but I mean, that is my one concern with it, and the fact that one of the things that is identified that should have been done by March and was actually this year, was actually finished in August last year, is being held up by a government department.
That is very unfortunate. Thank you for the comment, Lisa. We have about 3 minutes left, so if there's one last question or comment, now is the time to make it or ask the question. I don't see any hands. Sianne, do you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Thanks, Guy, and thanks, colleagues and Lisa, for the fantastic opportunity, really just to echo the fact that we have a really long way to go. Certainly, UCT, because of historical privileges, has had a head start, but we have gaps, and we know what those gaps are. And I'm really looking to focus on what Lisa has spoken about, which is the materiality. How can we now begin to address the materiality and the impact of gender-based violence in the long term beyond superficial prevention responses? Thank you, Guy.
Thanks, Sianne. Lisa, do you have any final comments before we close off this webinar?
No, except to thank people for attending. It's always good when people show up to hear more about services, and I hope they're from services and that this in some way helped them. And I'm happy to take any further questions offline or elsewhere if they wish to ask more. Fantastic. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thanks so much to Sianne and Lisa. I think this was an excellent presentation. Certainly a lot of detail. It was taking stock of where we're at and where we should be going. As you may be aware, we did record this and we are going to post it onto SaferSpaces in the next week or so. So thank you to everyone for participating, and also watch SaferSpaces for adverts about upcoming webinars. We're unlikely to have one this coming Friday, but certainly the Friday after that. And just watch SaferSpaces and watch the emails and the social medias for that. But just in a word of thanks also to acknowledge the Civilian Secretariat for Police Services, who are a key partner on this. Also to acknowledge GIZ Violence and Crime Prevention Program. There are a number of staff members from that program that are part of this webinar as well. So thank you so much for their support for SaferSpaces. We couldn't have these webinars without their support. So thanks to everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and thanks again to the speakers for giving such fantastic presentations. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Terence. Bye.
Bye-bye.